On a spring afternoon in 1831, in a clearing of packed dirt between a log store and a cluster of crude wooden buildings, a young man stood waiting. He was 22 years old. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, which in that place and that time made him something close to a giant. His arms hung long at his sides, the knuckles of his hands enlarged from years of gripping axe handles, and his shoulders, though narrow, were roped with the kind of muscle that comes not from vanity but from labor, from splitting rails, from hauling flatboats, from wrestling the earth itself into submission. His face was gaunt. His cheekbones stood out like ridges. His eyes, deep-set and gray, watched the crowd that had gathered around the edges of the clearing with an expression that those who knew him would later describe as melancholy, though in that moment it might simply have been focus. Across from him, separated by perhaps 10 feet of open ground, stood a shorter man, broader, thicker through the chest and arms. Jack Armstrong was 28 years old, and he was, by the rough consensus of Sangamon County, Illinois, the toughest man anyone had ever seen. He led a gang called the Clary's Grove Boys, young men from the settlement a few miles south who drank hard, fought harder, and answered to no authority but their own. Armstrong had never been thrown. He had never been beaten. And when the boastful merchant Denton Offutt had begun telling anyone who would listen that his new store clerk could whip any man in the county, Armstrong had taken it as both insult and invitation. The crowd numbered perhaps 40. Farmers, shopkeepers, day laborers, a few women watching from the porches of nearby buildings, their faces tight with disapproval or excitement or both. Money changed hands. Whiskey flasks circulated. The spring air carried the smell of turned earth and wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of the river not far to the west. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The young man rolled up his sleeves. His name was Abraham Lincoln. And what happened in the next few minutes, in that dusty clearing, in that half-built village, in that forgotten corner of a young nation still finding its shape, would set in motion a chain of events that would, 3 decades later, determine whether the United States of America would survive or shatter. But he could not have known that. No one watching could have known that. They saw only what was in front of them. 2 men about to fight. Lincoln set one condition before the match began. He asked that they wrestle by side holds, a style in which both men gripped each other around the waist, and the goal was to throw your opponent to the ground, not to pin him or choke him or gouge his eyes. It was the style he had grown up with, the style his Uncle Mordecai had taught him in the woods of Indiana. Armstrong, confident in his own strength, agreed. They stepped toward each other. What followed lasted somewhere between several minutes and the better part of an hour, depending on which account you trust. The 2 men locked up, each seeking leverage, each trying to find the angle that would let him lift and throw the other. They strained, they twisted, they circled in the dust, their boots scraping furrows in the packed dirt. The crowd shouted, bets were doubled, and still neither man went down. Lincoln, by most tellings, got the better of it in the end. The exact manner of his victory varies. Some accounts say he threw Armstrong cleanly. Others say Armstrong grew frustrated and began to fight dirty, grabbing and gouging, and that Lincoln, in a sudden flash of temper, seized him by the throat and held him at arm's length, daring the rest of the Clary's Grove Boys to come at him if they wished. What is consistent across the accounts is this: when the dust settled, Lincoln had not been thrown, and the village of New Salem had a new understanding of who he was. He was no longer the lanky stranger who had floated into town on a flatboat. He was someone to reckon with, someone who could hold his own, and in the logic of the frontier, that was the only credential that mattered. To understand how Abraham Lincoln ended up in that clearing, to understand why the outcome of a wrestling match in an Illinois village would matter for the history of a continent, we have to go back further. We have to go to the beginning. The beginning in this case is a 1-room cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky, on a cold morning in February 1809. The cabin sat on a small farm called Sinking Spring, named for the limestone sinkhole nearby where water pooled year-round. The walls were made of logs chinked with mud. The floor was packed earth. The roof leaked. A single door, hung on leather hinges, opened onto a landscape of half-cleared forest, stumps and brush, and the black skeletons of girdled trees waiting to fall. Inside, on a bed of corn husks covered with a bearskin, Nancy Hanks Lincoln gave birth to her second child, a boy, long and thin, and by one account so homely that his mother wept when she first saw him. They named him Abraham after his grandfather, a man who had been killed by Indians 25 years earlier while clearing a field, shot from the tree line while his sons worked beside him. The grandfather had been a prosperous farmer in Virginia before he migrated west. He had owned land. He had owned slaves. He had died face down in the dirt of Kentucky, and his family had scattered into poverty. This was the inheritance the boy was born into, a name, a memory of violence, and nothing else. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a carpenter and farmer who could neither read nor write, a hard man by some accounts, a man who believed in work and discipline and the Bible, in that order. A man who would rent out his son's labor to neighbors as soon as the boy was old enough to swing an axe, and who would keep the wages for himself. His mother, Nancy, was gentler, quieter. She taught the boy his letters. She told him stories. She died when he was 9 years old, of something the frontier called milk sickness, a poisoning that came from drinking the milk of cows that had grazed on white snake root. She died in the same one-room cabin where she had given birth to him, and the boy helped his father build her coffin from green lumber, and they buried her on a hill not far from the house. A year later, Thomas Lincoln remarried. His new wife, Sarah Bush Johnston, was a widow with 3 children of her own. She arrived at the cabin in Indiana. The family had moved west by then, deeper into the wilderness, and found it filthy, the children half feral, the father distant. She cleaned the cabin, she brought books, she treated the boy, Abraham, as her own. Years later, when Lincoln was a famous man, he would speak of his stepmother with a warmth he never showed for his father. He would call her his best friend in the world, and she, in turn, would remember him as a boy who was always reading, who would walk miles to borrow a book, who would write words in charcoal on the back of a wooden shovel when paper was scarce, who would lie in front of the fire at night and read until the embers died. But reading on the frontier was not enough to make a man. Work was what made a man. Strength was what made a man. And so the boy learned to work. He split rails. He cleared land. He drove a team of oxen through mud so deep that the animals sometimes sank to their bellies. He grew tall, taller than anyone in the county, taller than anyone his neighbors had ever seen, and his body, stretched by that strange, rapid growth, became a kind of instrument. Long arms, long legs, hands that could palm a man's skull, a reach that gave him an advantage in any physical contest. And there were contests, many of them. Wrestling on the frontier was not a sport. It was a social institution. It was how young men established their place in the hierarchy of a community that had no courts, no police, no formal structures of authority. If 2 men had a dispute, they wrestled. If a newcomer arrived in a settlement, he wrestled the local champion to prove his worth. If a man wanted to be taken seriously, wanted to be heard when he spoke, wanted to be followed when he led, he first had to show that he could not be thrown. Lincoln's uncle Mordecai was one of the best wrestlers in Kentucky. He taught the boy the holds, the feints, the way to use your height and reach to keep a shorter man off balance, the way to read your opponent's weight and momentum and turn it against him. Lincoln practiced these skills for years in the fields and clearings of Indiana, against cousins and neighbors and any man who would take him on. By the time he was 21, he had a reputation. Not as a brawler, he was too gentle for that, too inclined to make a joke rather than a fist, but as a grappler, a technician, a man who could hold his own against anyone. And then he left. The leaving was the first great decision of his life. He was 22 years old. He had been working for his father for as long as he could remember, and by the law and custom of the time, his father was entitled to his labor until he turned 21. But even after that birthday passed, Lincoln stayed. He helped his family move from Indiana to Illinois, driving one of the ox teams across the frozen prairies in March 1830. He helped them clear land for a new farm near Decatur. He split rails, thousands of them, 10,000 of them, the logs piled in zigzag fences across the flat prairie landscape. And then, in the spring of 1831, he told his father he was done. The break was not dramatic. There was no confrontation that the sources record, no shouting, no ultimatum. Lincoln simply announced that he was going to make his own way. He joined a crew of men hired to float a cargo of goods down the Sangamon River to New Orleans, 1,000 miles of water through swamps and bayous and past the slave markets of the Deep South. When he returned from that voyage, he did not go back to his father's farm. He went instead to the little village of New Salem, where a merchant named Denton Offutt had offered him a job clerking at a store. New Salem, in 1831, was barely a village at all. It had been founded only 2 years earlier, carved out of the prairie on a bluff above the Sangamon River. It had perhaps 100 residents, 24 buildings, and an air of rough optimism, the belief, common on the frontier, that this particular spot would grow into something important. Lincoln arrived there with nothing but the clothes on his back and whatever small sum he had saved from his work on the flatboat. He was a stranger. He knew no one. He had no family connections, no education to speak of, no wealth, no prospects. What he had was his body. And in a frontier community, a body like his was a kind of currency. Denton Offutt, his new employer, understood this immediately. Offutt was a talker, a promoter, a man who liked to boast about the things he owned and the people he employed. Within weeks of Lincoln's arrival, Offutt was telling anyone who would listen that his new clerk was the strongest man in the county, possibly the strongest man in Illinois, certainly strong enough to whip any challenger who cared to test the claim. The Clary's Grove Boys heard about this. The Clary's Grove Boys were a loose confederation of young men from a settlement about 2 miles south of New Salem. They were rough, rowdy, hard-drinking, and proud of it. They worked when they had to and fought when they wanted to, and they had a leader, Jack Armstrong, who had never been beaten in a wrestling match. When they heard that some newcomer was being talked up as a champion, they took it as a challenge. The match was arranged. The date was set. The whole village turned out to watch. We have, at this point, reached the limits of what we can know with certainty. The sources for Lincoln's wrestling career are frustratingly incomplete. We have no contemporary newspaper accounts of the Armstrong match. New Salem had no newspaper, and the papers in Springfield, 20 miles away, did not concern themselves with the scuffles of backwoods villages. We have no letters from Lincoln himself about the event, no diary entries, no legal documents. What we have instead are the memories of men who were there. Memories recorded decades later, when Lincoln was famous, when the teller had every incentive to place himself at the center of the story, to embellish, to improve. William Herndon, Lincoln's law partner in the 1850s, collected many of these memories after Lincoln's death. He interviewed neighbors, friends, acquaintances, anyone who had known Lincoln in the early years. The accounts he gathered vary wildly. In one version, Lincoln throws Armstrong cleanly and fairly. In another, Armstrong cheats, and Lincoln responds by seizing him by the throat. In a third, the match ends in a draw, with both men acknowledging the other's skill. The details shift. The dialogue changes. The number of spectators grows or shrinks depending on who is telling the story. What remains consistent is the outcome. Lincoln was not defeated. Whether he won outright or fought to a draw, he proved himself. And in the days and weeks that followed, something remarkable happened. The Clary's Grove Boys, instead of holding a grudge, became his friends. This was Lincoln's gift, perhaps his greatest gift, the one that would carry him further than his strength or his height or his reading. He had a way of turning enemies into allies, a way of diffusing hostility with humor, with humility, with a kind of radical decency that disarmed people who expected to dislike him. Jack Armstrong, who had every reason to resent the young stranger who had challenged his dominance, became one of Lincoln's closest companions. The Clary's Grove Boys, who had come to New Salem looking for a fight, became his supporters, his advocates, his friends. And New Salem, which had been just a stopping point, became something more. It became the place where Abraham Lincoln learned how to be Abraham Lincoln. The village was a laboratory, a classroom, a proving ground. In the 6 years Lincoln spent in New Salem, from 1831 to 1837, he tried on identities the way a man tries on coats. He was a store clerk, he was a mill worker, he was a postmaster, he was a surveyor, he was a soldier, briefly, in the Black Hawk War of 1832, elected captain of his company by the men who served under him. He was a candidate for the state legislature, losing his first race in 1832, winning his second in 1834. He was a law student, reading Blackstone's commentaries by candlelight, borrowing books from a lawyer in Springfield, teaching himself the profession that would become his life's work. And through it all, he was a wrestler. The matches continued, not every day, not every week, but regularly enough that his reputation spread across central Illinois. He wrestled at militia musters. He wrestled at county fairs. He wrestled for money, for drinks, for bragging rights. He wrestled because it was expected of him, because the man who had beaten Jack Armstrong could not refuse a challenge without losing face. And he wrestled perhaps because he was good at it, because there is a pleasure in mastery, a satisfaction in knowing that your body can do what you ask of it. The figure of 300 matches comes down to us as legend. Some Lincoln scholars accept it, others dismiss it as mythology. What we can say with confidence is that Lincoln wrestled frequently and successfully from his teenage years until his early 30s, a span of roughly 15 years. We can say that he was known for his strength, his reach, and his technique. We can say that he preferred wrestling by side holds, the style that rewards leverage and balance over raw aggression, and we can say that he lost only once. That single loss deserves its own telling. In the spring of 1832, a Sauk war chief named Black Hawk led a band of several hundred warriors and their families back across the Mississippi River into Illinois. The land had been ceded to the United States by treaty, but Black Hawk disputed the treaty's legitimacy, and his return sparked panic among the white settlers of the region. The governor called up the militia. Volunteers flooded into the staging areas, and Abraham Lincoln, 23 years old, joined a company of men from New Salem. The company elected him captain. This was not a testament to his military experience, he had none, but to his standing in the community. The men who chose him were the same men who had watched him wrestle Jack Armstrong, the same men who had drunk with him and joked with him and come to trust him. They wanted a leader they respected, and Lincoln was that man. The Black Hawk War was, in the end, a small and ugly affair. Black Hawk's band was pursued across northern Illinois and into Wisconsin, harried by disease and starvation, and finally slaughtered at the Battle of Bad Axe in August 1832. Lincoln saw no combat. His company spent most of its time marching through swamps and prairies, chasing rumors of Indians, finding nothing. But it was during this campaign, along a trail somewhere in the Illinois wilderness, that Lincoln met his match. The circumstances, as with so much of Lincoln's early life, come to us through the haze of memory. Lincoln's company and another had encountered each other on the march, and a dispute arose, over camping ground, over supplies, over some insult that one group had given the other. Tempers flared, threats were exchanged, and rather than let the situation escalate into a brawl or a bloodletting, the men agreed to settle it the frontier way. Each side would put forward its champion. The two men would wrestle. Whoever won, his company would have the disputed ground. Lincoln stepped forward. The other company sent a soldier named Lorenzo Dow Thompson. Thompson was a different kind of opponent than Lincoln had faced before. He was skilled, experienced, trained in the techniques that Lincoln knew, but also in techniques Lincoln did not. The rules were set for 3 rounds. The man who threw his opponent twice would be the winner. Both sides placed bets: money, blankets, knives, whiskey, whatever valuables the soldiers had with them. The two men circled, they locked up, they strained against each other, and Thompson threw Lincoln. The soldiers shouted. The odds shifted. Lincoln got to his feet, dusted himself off, and prepared for the second round. Again they circled, again they locked. This time, both men fell together. A simultaneous collapse, neither clearly the victor, what the wrestlers of the time called a dogfall. Lincoln's men cried foul. They insisted the round should be re-wrestled. They pointed to the fall, to the timing, to any detail that might save their captain from defeat. But Lincoln shook his head. He had been beaten, he said. Thompson was the better man. There was no shame in it. And that was the end of it. Lincoln walked away from his only defeat with his honor intact, perhaps more intact than if he had won, because he had shown something that mattered more than strength. He had shown honesty, humility, a willingness to accept a loss and move on. It was a quality that would define him for the rest of his life. The years after New Salem were years of transformation. In 1837, Lincoln moved to Springfield, the new state capital, to practice law. He was 28 years old. He had served 2 terms in the state legislature. He had passed the bar exam after years of self-study. He arrived in Springfield on a borrowed horse, carrying everything he owned in 2 saddlebags, and walked into a store owned by a man named Joshua Speed. Speed remembered the encounter for the rest of his life. Lincoln had asked about the price of bedding for a single room. Speed had calculated $17. Lincoln had looked at him with those deep-set gray eyes and said that he could not afford it, that if Speed would trust him until Christmas, he would pay if he could, but that if he failed in business, he would probably never pay at all. Speed offered to share his own room and a bed, free of charge. Lincoln carried his saddlebags upstairs. When he came back down, Speed recalled, his face had changed. "Well, Speed," Lincoln said, "I am moved." It was the beginning of a friendship that would last for the rest of their lives, and it was the beginning of Lincoln's transformation from frontier grappler to something else entirely. He still wrestled occasionally in those early Springfield years. The stories filtered back, of challenges accepted, of matches won, of the lanky lawyer from Sangamon County who could still throw any man foolish enough to face him. But the wrestling gradually became memory, then legend, then a curiosity that Lincoln himself seemed ambivalent about. In 1858, when Lincoln ran for the United States Senate against Stephen Douglas, his wrestling past surfaced in the first of their famous debates. Douglas, trying to paint Lincoln as a backwoods ruffian unfit for high office, made reference to his opponent's history in the ring. Lincoln did not deny it. He did not apologize for it. But he did not celebrate it either. He had become a different man by then, a lawyer, a husband, a father, a politician of growing reputation. The wrestling was part of him, but it was not all of him. And yet the wrestling never quite left him. In 1860, during his campaign for president, visitors to Springfield sometimes asked about the old stories. Lincoln would deflect or joke or tell a self-deprecating anecdote about his youth. But there was one incident that his associates remembered for years afterward. A man had come to Springfield that summer, a large man, a former wrestler himself, who had heard the stories and wanted to test the famous candidate. He issued a challenge. Lincoln, by then 51 years old, with a campaign to run and a nation to convince, considered the offer. And then, according to witnesses, he rolled up his sleeves. The man backed down. Whether because he saw something in Lincoln's eyes, or because the situation suddenly seemed absurd, or because someone in Lincoln's entourage intervened, the sources do not agree. But the story circulated, and it became part of the Lincoln legend. The man who, on the verge of the presidency, was still willing to step into the ring. We are left, then, with questions the sources cannot answer. What did wrestling mean to Abraham Lincoln? What did it teach him? What did it cost him? The historians offer theories. Some see the wrestling as a crucible, the place where Lincoln learned to manage conflict, to read opponents, to turn hostility into alliance. Others see it as a liability, a remnant of the rough frontier world that Lincoln spent his adult life trying to transcend. Still others see it simply as a biographical curiosity, a colorful detail in a life full of more consequential events. But the wrestling was there. It happened. For roughly 15 years, from his childhood in Indiana to his early 30s in Springfield, Abraham Lincoln was a competitive wrestler who rarely lost. He tested himself against the strongest men in 3 states. He built a reputation on his body before he built one on his mind. And when he needed to establish himself in a new community, to prove that he belonged, that he could be trusted, that he was worth following, he did it the oldest way there is. He stepped into the ring. In 1992, more than a century after his death, Abraham Lincoln was inducted into the National Wrestling Hall of Fame in Stillwater, Oklahoma. The citation named him an outstanding American, a category reserved for figures who achieved greatness in fields other than wrestling, but who used the sport as a foundation for their later success. He stands in that hall alongside presidents, generals, astronauts, and business leaders. He is, as far as the records show, the only president so honored. The boy who was born in a one-room cabin in Kentucky, who learned to wrestle from his uncle in the woods of Indiana, who proved himself in a dusty clearing in New Salem, Illinois. That boy became the man who held a nation together when it tried to tear itself apart. But before he was that man, he was this one. 6 feet 4 inches tall, sleeves rolled, standing in a patch of trampled grass between two rough-hewn buildings, waiting for his opponent to step forward. A long life ahead of him, a country waiting on the other side. The question that remains, the question that the sources pose but cannot answer, is how the wrestler became the president. Not in the simple biographical sense. We can trace the steps. New Salem to Springfield, Springfield to Congress, Congress to the Lincoln-Douglas debates, the debates to the Republican nomination, the nomination to the White House. The sequence is clear. What is less clear is the relationship between the man who wrestled Jack Armstrong and the man who preserved the Union. What did Lincoln carry forward from those years on the prairie? What did the ring teach him that the law books could not? One answer, perhaps the most obvious, is that wrestling taught him about power, not power in the abstract, not power as a political concept, but power as a physical reality, the force that one body can exert against another. The way that leverage and position can multiply strength, the way that a man who seems weaker can defeat a man who seems stronger if he understands where to apply pressure and when to wait. Lincoln was never a man of obvious power. He did not look powerful. His suits hung loose on his frame. His voice was high and thin, not the resonant baritone of a natural orator. He walked with a shambling gait, as if his long limbs had never quite learned to coordinate. But the men who worked with him, the generals, the cabinet secretaries, the senators and congressmen who came to the White House seeking favors, those men learned quickly that Lincoln was not weak. He was patient. He was strategic. He understood when to yield and when to hold firm. Frederick Douglass, who met Lincoln several times during the war years, described him as a man who listened more than he spoke, who considered more than he demanded, who treated even his critics with a kind of disarming gentleness, but who, when the moment came for decision, was immovable. I felt then, as I had felt on several previous occasions, Douglass wrote, that the man in the White House was a man of depth, a man of thought, a man of will. A man of will. It is the phrase a wrestler might use. Another answer, subtler, perhaps more speculative, is that wrestling taught Lincoln about failure. He lost only once, as far as the records show. Lorenzo Dow Thompson threw him in that clearing during the Black Hawk War, and Lincoln admitted defeat, and that was the end of it. But in the years that followed, Lincoln would lose much more. He would lose elections. He would lose cases. He would lose friends, allies, supporters. He would lose children. His son Edward in 1850 at the age of 3. His son William in 1862 at the age of 11 in the White House itself, while a war raged beyond the windows. And he would lose soldiers, hundreds of thousands of them. The scale of death in the Civil War exceeded anything America had ever experienced, exceeded anything Lincoln himself had imagined when he took the oath of office in March 1861. By the time the war ended, more than 600,000 men were dead, Union and Confederate combined, more than the deaths in all other American wars put together. Lincoln felt every one of those deaths. Visitors to the White House during the war years described a man who aged decades in months, whose face grew lined and gray, whose famous melancholy deepened into something closer to despair. But he did not stop. He did not yield. He absorbed the losses, mourned them, and kept fighting. This is what the wrestler learns: that defeat is not the same as destruction, that being thrown does not mean being broken, that you can stand up, dust yourself off, acknowledge what happened, and prepare for the next round. Lincoln told a story late in the war about a man who came to him seeking a pardon for a soldier sentenced to be shot for desertion. The man pleaded. He wept. He begged Lincoln to spare the soldier's life. And Lincoln, who had signed so many pardons, who had commuted so many death sentences, who was known throughout the army as a soft touch for condemned men, listened to the plea and refused. The soldier had deserted his post in the face of the enemy. Other soldiers had seen him run. If he went unpunished, others would run too. The army would dissolve. The war would be lost. The Union would fail. Lincoln signed the order for execution. The man was shot the next morning. And Lincoln, according to the witness who recorded the conversation, said something afterward that has stayed with historians ever since. He said that he felt like a man about to be hanged, who said that if it were not for the honor of the thing, he would rather walk. He lost that soldier. He lost that plea. He absorbed the loss, mourned it, and kept fighting. It is not enough to say that wrestling taught him this. Wrestling alone does not make a man capable of bearing the weight of 600,000 dead. But wrestling was where he first learned the lesson, where he first discovered that he could lose and survive, where he first understood that the fight is not over until you decide it is over. The sun is setting now over New Salem, Illinois, or over the place where New Salem used to be. The village itself is gone. It was abandoned in the 1840s after the county seat moved to Petersburg, and the merchants and farmers and tradesmen drifted away to wherever opportunity called them next. For decades, the bluff above the Sangamon River sat empty, the buildings slowly collapsing, the memories slowly fading. By the end of the 19th century, nothing remained but a few foundation stones and the stories old men told about the days when Abraham Lincoln lived there. In 1906, the state of Illinois began to reconstruct the village. Archaeologists mapped the old building sites. Historians gathered the scattered records. Carpenters built replicas of the log cabins and stores and mills, placing them where the originals had stood. Today, New Salem is a state historic site, a living history museum where costumed interpreters demonstrate the crafts and customs of the 1830s, and tourists walk the same paths that Lincoln walked nearly 2 centuries ago. There is a spot near the reconstructed Offutt store where a sign marks the approximate location of the wrestling match. The sign tells the story in brief: Lincoln versus Armstrong, spring of 1831, the match that made the newcomer's reputation. It does not mention the dogfall theory or the throat grab theory or any of the variant accounts that complicate the neat story of victory. It offers a narrative, clean and simple, and lets the tourists take their photographs and move on. But the dust is still there beneath the grass that grows over it, and the river is still there, winding slow and brown through the Illinois prairie. And somewhere in the molecules of that place, in the atomic memory of the earth itself, the vibration of those footsteps persists. 2 men circling, 2 men grappling, 2 men straining against each other in the late afternoon light of a frontier spring. One of them would become president. One of them would fade into history. Both of them were, in that moment, simply men, young, strong, alive, trying to prove something to the watching world. That is where the story begins. But it is not where the story ends. The years after New Salem were years of transformation, slow, uneven, and often painful. Lincoln left the village in 1837, 6 years after his arrival, carrying with him a law license he had earned by reading borrowed books, a political reputation he had built through careful service in the state legislature, and debts he would spend years repaying. He moved to Springfield, the new state capital, and began the work of becoming the man history would remember. Springfield was not New Salem. It was a town with pretensions, a place that wanted to be a city, with brick buildings and wooden sidewalks and a social hierarchy that the young lawyer had to learn to navigate. The wrestling matches grew less frequent. The physical contests that had made his name in the village gave way to verbal ones. Debates in courtrooms, arguments in legislative halls, the endless sparring of frontier politics. But the body that had dominated those matches remained. At 30, Lincoln was still 6 feet 4 inches tall, still lean, still possessed of those remarkable arms and that deceptive strength. He was still, in some fundamental way, a wrestler, even when the arena had changed. He practiced law on the 8th Judicial Circuit, riding from town to town across central Illinois, sleeping in cramped tavern rooms, arguing cases in packed courthouses, building a reputation for honesty and precision that would follow him for the rest of his career. The circuit was a kind of traveling fellowship, lawyers and judges moving together through the prairie, sharing meals and stories and the long hours of horseback travel that the distances required. Lincoln became known as a man who could make people laugh, who could tell stories that left entire courtrooms breathless, who could argue a case with a clarity that made complex matters suddenly simple. But he was also known as something else, a man who rarely lost. Not every case, of course. No lawyer wins every case. But Lincoln had a habit of winning the ones that mattered, of finding the angle that his opponents had missed, of preparing more thoroughly than anyone expected. His courtroom style was not flamboyant. He spoke simply, directly, without the rhetorical flourishes that other lawyers favored. He stated his case. He acknowledged his weaknesses. He dismantled the opposing argument piece by piece, calmly, methodically, as if he were explaining arithmetic to a child. And when the verdict came, more often than not, it came in his favor. His law partner, William Herndon, who knew him better than almost anyone, later wrote that Lincoln's legal mind worked like a machine, patient, relentless, designed to solve problems. But Herndon also noted something else. He noted that Lincoln seemed to draw a particular energy from opposition. The harder the case, the more animated he became. The stronger the adversary, the more focused his preparation. He did not shrink from difficult fights. He sought them out. And when he won them, he did so not through brilliance alone, but through what Herndon called a certain dogged determination, a refusal to be beaten, a willingness to keep working when other men would have given up. It is impossible to know how much of this came from the wrestling years. The human personality is too complex, too shaped by 1,000 factors, to trace any single trait to any single cause. But the pattern is there, visible across the decades. A young man who learned to fight on the grass of New Salem, who carried that fighter's instinct into every arena he entered, who never forgot what it felt like to be locked in a contest where only one man could prevail. In 1842, Lincoln married Mary Todd, a woman of education and ambition who saw in the lanky lawyer something that others had missed. Their courtship had been complicated, an engagement broken, a period of separation, a reconciliation that surprised their friends. But when they finally married, in November of that year, they entered into a partnership that would define both of their lives. Mary was not an easy woman. She was brilliant, mercurial, prone to rages and depressions that her husband learned to navigate with the same patience he brought to his legal work. She was also fiercely loyal, deeply ambitious for her husband's career, and willing to push him toward goals he might not have reached on his own. Their marriage was tumultuous. Visitors to their Springfield home sometimes heard shouting through the walls. But it was also, in its own way, a wrestling match. Two strong-willed people locked in an embrace that was part struggle, part devotion, part the simple work of building a life together. They had 4 sons. Edward, their second, died at the age of 3. Willie, their third, would die in the White House at 11. Tad, the youngest, would outlive his father by only 6 years. Robert, the eldest, would live to see the 20th century, an old man haunted by memories of a family that had been consumed by grief. The Lincolns buried children. They mourned in ways that left permanent marks on both of them. And they kept going, because that was what their generation did. Because there was no alternative. Because the world did not stop for sorrow. Lincoln's ambition grew with the years. He served a single term in the United States House of Representatives from 1847 to 1849, where he opposed the Mexican-American War and earned a reputation as a critic of President James K. Polk. The criticism cost him popularity at home. He did not seek re-election. He returned to Springfield, to his law practice, to the quiet work of making a living and raising a family. For 5 years, he seemed to have stepped back from politics altogether. But the ambition had not died. It had simply gone underground, waiting for the moment when circumstances would summon it back. That moment came in 1854, when Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The act was the work of Stephen Douglas, the senior senator from Illinois, a small, combative man known as the Little Giant, who believed that the question of slavery in the new territories should be settled by the settlers themselves. Popular sovereignty, he called it. Let the people decide. The principle sounded democratic, even noble. But its effect was to repeal the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had banned slavery in the Northern Territories for more than 3 decades. Now, suddenly, slavery could spread anywhere that white settlers chose to carry it. The act tore the country apart. It shattered the old political coalitions. It created new parties and destroyed old ones. And it drew Abraham Lincoln back into the arena. He had always opposed slavery. Not with the fire of the abolitionists. He was too cautious, too politically careful, too aware of the limits of what could be achieved. But he had always believed that slavery was morally wrong, that it violated the founding principles of the Republic, that it should be prevented from spreading even if it could not yet be abolished where it already existed. The Kansas-Nebraska Act offended him on every level. It offended his sense of justice, it offended his reading of history, and it offended his understanding of how a republic was supposed to work. He began to speak, first in small towns across Illinois, then in larger ones, then in halls and courthouses where hundreds gathered to hear him. His voice was high and nasal, not naturally commanding, but his arguments were devastating. He dismantled Douglas's logic piece by piece, the way he dismantled opposing counsel in the courtroom. He quoted the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the statements of the founders. He forced his audiences to confront the contradiction at the heart of American life, a nation founded on the principle that all men are created equal, yet built upon the labor of millions who were held in bondage. The debates of 1858, the Lincoln-Douglas debates as history would call them, were the culmination of this reawakening. 7 debates across 7 towns in Illinois, held in the final months before a Senate election that the whole country was watching. Douglas was the incumbent, the frontrunner for the Democratic presidential nomination, a man of national reputation. Lincoln was a former one-term congressman who had spent 5 years in political obscurity. The odds were not in his favor. But Lincoln did not think in terms of odds. He thought in terms of arguments, and his argument was stronger. He forced Douglas to defend the indefensible. He exposed the moral emptiness of popular sovereignty, the idea that slavery could be voted up or down like a local tax, as if the humanity of millions of black Americans were a matter for ballot boxes to decide. He lost the Senate race. The Illinois legislature chose Douglas by a margin of 54 to 46. But he won something larger. He won a national reputation. He won the attention of Republicans across the North who were looking for a candidate who could challenge the Democrats in 1860. He won, in other words, the preliminary match that would lead to the main event. And throughout those debates, throughout those long speeches in the summer heat and autumn chill of Illinois, the metaphor of wrestling kept appearing. Douglas himself invoked it in the first debate at Ottawa, mocking Lincoln's frontier reputation as a grappler. Lincoln turned the insult into a compliment. He knew what he had been, he knew what he had become, and he knew that the skills were not so different, the patience, the preparation, the refusal to be thrown. The presidency came in 1860, and with it came a war that Lincoln had not wanted but could not avoid. South Carolina seceded in December, 6 weeks after his election. 6 more states followed before he even took the oath of office. By the time he stood on the steps of the Capitol on March 4, 1861, delivering an inaugural address that pleaded for peace, even as it promised to defend the Union, the Confederate government had already formed, and Jefferson Davis had already been sworn in as its president. The new administration inherited a country that was breaking apart. Lincoln spent the first months trying to hold things together. He tried diplomacy, conciliation, delay. He refused to accept secession, but he also refused to fire the first shot. When Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter in April, he had his answer. The war had come. It would last 4 years. It would kill more Americans than any war before or since, and it would transform Abraham Lincoln from a political moderate into the great emancipator, the man who ended slavery in America. But that transformation did not happen overnight. Lincoln entered the war as a conservative. He promised not to interfere with slavery where it already existed. He insisted that the war was about preserving the Union, not freeing the enslaved. He revoked emancipation orders issued by overzealous generals. He worried about border states, about public opinion, about the constitutional limits of his authority. For the first year and a half of the war, he moved cautiously, incrementally, as if he were still a lawyer building a case rather than a president fighting for national survival. The change came gradually, driven by the logic of war itself. Enslaved people fled to Union lines by the thousands, seeking freedom, offering labor, forcing the army to decide what to do with them. Military necessity demanded that the Confederacy be weakened by any means available, and slavery was the foundation of Confederate power. The moral argument, which Lincoln had always believed, merged with the practical argument which circumstances now demanded. By the summer of 1862, he had made his decision. Slavery would end. The only question was how. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued on January 1, 1863, freed the enslaved in the Confederate States. It did not end slavery everywhere. It applied only to areas in rebellion where the federal government had no effective authority. Critics called it toothless, a war measure with no moral force. But Lincoln understood what they did not. The proclamation transformed the war. It made the Union Army an army of liberation. It invited black men to enlist, and nearly 180,000 would serve before the war's end. It made it impossible for Britain or France to recognize the Confederacy without endorsing slavery. And it set in motion the political process that would culminate in the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery throughout the United States forever. The man who signed that proclamation was not the same man who had wrestled Jack Armstrong in the dust of New Salem. 30 years had passed. The lean young body had thickened. The face had grown lined with sorrow. The dark hair had gone gray. But something remained, something in the posture, in the way he carried himself, in the refusal to be thrown. He absorbed blow after blow: Bull Run, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville. The casualty lists that arrived daily, the names of the dead filling column after column in newspapers across the North. He endured criticism from every side. Abolitionists who said he moved too slowly, conservatives who said he had gone too far, generals who thought they knew better, politicians who wanted his job. His own cabinet was filled with rivals. His own party questioned his leadership, and still he kept fighting. He found Grant. That was the turning point, though it did not feel like one at the time. Ulysses S. Grant was a failure by most conventional measures, a man who had left the Army, failed at farming, failed at business, and been reduced to clerking in his father's leather goods store when the war began. But he had one quality that Lincoln recognized. He fought. He did not retreat. He did not make excuses. He took his losses and kept moving forward. Lincoln saw in Grant something of himself, that determination, that refusal to quit, that understanding that wars are won not by avoiding battles, but by winning them. Grant took command of all Union forces in March 1864 and began the Overland Campaign, a sustained assault on Lee's army that would last 40 days and cost more than 50,000 Union casualties. The newspapers called it butchery. Lincoln's opponents called for peace negotiations. The Democratic Party nominated George McClellan on a platform that called the war a failure. In August, Lincoln privately believed he would lose the election. He wrote a memo to his cabinet asking them to cooperate with the incoming administration in saving the Union before the new president could surrender it. But Sherman took Atlanta on September 2nd, and everything changed. The war was not a failure. The Union was winning. Lincoln won re-election with 55% of the vote and an electoral landslide. And in his second inaugural address on March 4, 1865, he delivered the most profound moral reckoning in American political history. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. He was saying something that no American president had ever said before, that the war was divine punishment for the national sin of slavery, that the suffering of the battlefields was the price that white America owed for the suffering of the slave cabins, that justice demanded blood for blood. He was saying it not in anger, but in sorrow, not in triumph, but in humility. He was acknowledging that the nation he had saved was a nation that had deserved to be broken, and that its salvation came not through merit, but through grace. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. 41 days later, he was dead. The assassination has been told so many times that it has become almost impossible to see it freshly. Ford's Theater. Good Friday. The comedy playing on the stage below. John Wilkes Booth slipping into the presidential box, a single-shot Derringer in his hand. The pistols crack. Lincoln slumping forward, Mary screaming, the chaos that followed. He died the next morning at 7:22 a.m. in a narrow bed in a boarding house across the street from the theater. His body was too long for the bed. They laid him diagonally, his feet hanging off the edge. The room was crowded with cabinet members, generals, doctors, and friends, all watching the life drain slowly from the man who had held them together for 4 years. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who had sometimes opposed Lincoln, sometimes undermined him, sometimes despaired of his leadership, looked at the body when the breathing finally stopped and spoke words that have echoed ever since. Now he belongs to the ages. Or perhaps he said angels. The witnesses disagree. The acoustics of history are imperfect. What matters is what Stanton meant, that Lincoln had passed from flesh into myth, from president into symbol, from the particular to the eternal. The man who had been born in a Kentucky log cabin, who had grown up splitting rails in Indiana, who had wrestled Jack Armstrong in the dust of New Salem, who had argued cases on the 8th Judicial Circuit, who had lost a Senate race and won a presidency, who had presided over the bloodiest war in American history, and emerged with his hands clean and his conscience clear. That man was gone. In his place was Lincoln. The Lincoln of statues and memorials. The Lincoln of the $5 bill. The Lincoln who would be invoked by every subsequent generation to justify whatever cause they held most dear. But the man remains beneath the myth if you know where to look. He remains in the photographs that survive him, those extraordinary images captured by the primitive cameras of the mid-19th century, which required subjects to hold perfectly still for seconds at a time. Lincoln's face in these photographs is unlike any other face in American political history. It is asymmetrical, almost disturbingly so. The left side seems to belong to a different man than the right. The cheekbones are high and sharp, the eye sockets deep, the skin stretched tight over a skull that seems barely contained by its covering. In some images, he looks haggard, ancient, a man bearing the weight of centuries. In others, the earlier ones, before the war had carved its marks into him, there is something almost playful around the eyes, a hint of the storyteller, the jokester, the man who could hold a room spellbound with a yarn about two farmers arguing over a fence line. The photographers who captured him often remarked on the difficulty of the task. His face, they said, changed constantly. In motion, in conversation, in the act of thinking through a problem aloud, Lincoln was animated, expressive, almost handsome in the way that intelligent faces can be handsome. But the moment he went still for the camera, something collapsed. The light seemed to catch him wrong. The angles of his face, which served him so well in person, became harsh, severe, almost grotesque in silver and glass. He knew this about himself. He joked about it. When accused during the 1860 campaign of being two-faced, he responded, "If I had two faces, would I be wearing this one?" The body that carried that face was equally remarkable. 6 feet 4 inches, in an age when the average American man stood 5'7". Arms so long that his sleeves were perpetually too short, his wrists extending past the cuffs like a boy who had outgrown his Sunday clothes. Hands that were remembered by everyone who shook them, enormous, rough-skinned, with a grip that could crush but rarely did. He was conscious of his size, conscious of the effect it had on others. In political gatherings, he often slouched, bending his spine to bring himself closer to the height of the men around him. In courtrooms, he used his height strategically, looming over witnesses and juries when he wanted to intimidate, folding himself into a chair and speaking softly when he wanted to persuade. That body had been shaped by labor. The log splitting of his youth had given him shoulders and arms that were disproportionately powerful for his lean frame. He could, witnesses attested, hold an axe by the end of its handle and extend it straight out from his body, parallel to the ground, for minutes at a time, a feat of strength that most men could not match for seconds. He could lift weights that larger men could not budge, and he could wrestle. The wrestling is the thread that connects the young Lincoln to the old one, the rail splitter to the president, the body to the mind. It is the thing that people forget about him, buried beneath the monuments and the speeches and the mythology of martyrdom. But it was there, at the foundation of who he was, and understanding it helps us understand everything that came after. Consider what wrestling actually is, stripped of its modern theatrical trappings. It is the oldest combat sport. It appears in the earliest human records, on cave walls in Sumerian poetry, in the Bible. It is universal across cultures because it emerges naturally from the human condition. Two bodies, equally weighted, equally matched, struggling for dominance without weapons, without distance, without the mediation of tools. It is problem-solving at the most fundamental level. How do I use what I have, my weight, my leverage, my balance, my strength, my endurance, to put you on the ground? How do I read what you're doing, anticipate your next move, counter before you can execute? How do I remain calm under pressure, think clearly while my muscles burn and my lungs strain and my opponent's weight bears down on me? Lincoln was extraordinarily good at this. The 300 matches that legend attributes to him may be exaggerated, but the underlying truth is not. He was a grappler of genuine skill, known across central Illinois for his ability to read an opponent, to find leverage where others saw only strength, to outlast men who seemed better positioned to win. And the mental habits that made him good at wrestling, patience, calculation, the ability to absorb punishment while waiting for the opening, the refusal to panic when the situation seemed lost, these were exactly the habits that would define his presidency. Think of the war years as a wrestling match extended over 4 years. Lincoln taking control of an army that did not know how to fight, a general staff that did not know how to lead, a civilian population that did not know how long it could endure. His opponents, the Confederate leadership, but also his own generals, his own cabinet, his own party, constantly maneuvering, constantly pressing, constantly trying to force him into positions he did not want to occupy. And Lincoln, time and again, finding ways to create space, absorbing blows, giving ground when he had to, waiting, always waiting, for the moment when he could shift his weight and throw. The Emancipation Proclamation was such a moment. He had been preparing it for months, had shown drafts to his cabinet in the summer of 1862, had been told to wait for a military victory, wait for the right political conditions, wait for the moment when the move would look like strength rather than desperation. And he had waited. Through the disaster of Second Bull Run, through the bloody stalemate at Antietam, through the long, terrible months when it seemed the war might simply grind on forever without resolution. He waited until the opening appeared, and then he moved, and the entire dynamic of the conflict shifted in a single stroke. McClellan never understood this. McClellan saw war as a chess match, a game of positions and maneuvers, where the goal was to achieve perfect readiness before committing to action. Lincoln saw it as a wrestling match, a struggle where momentum mattered more than position, where the enemy's movement created opportunities that would vanish if not seized, where waiting for perfect conditions meant waiting forever. Their conflict was not merely a clash of personalities or military philosophies. It was a clash of fundamental orientations toward the problem of struggle itself. Grant, when he finally emerged, understood what Lincoln understood. Grant's approach to war was a wrestler's approach. Apply pressure, stay in contact, do not give the enemy time to recover, to regroup, to escape. If one move fails, try another. If you lose ground, take it back. The war of attrition that Grant waged in 1864 and 1865, the grinding, bloody, relentless advance through Virginia that cost 60,000 Union casualties in 6 weeks, was wrestling at the scale of armies. It was ugly, it was costly, it was effective. And Lincoln, watching from Washington, recognized in Grant a man who thought about conflict the way he did. There is a moment from the spring of 1864 that captures this recognition. Grant had just launched the Overland Campaign, his first offensive as general-in-chief. The Battle of the Wilderness, fought in the same dense Virginia forest where Stonewall Jackson had fallen a year earlier, had been a tactical draw at best. The Union Army had suffered 18,000 casualties in 2 days of confused, brutal fighting. Previous commanders, McClellan, Burnside, Hooker, had responded to such losses by retreating, regrouping, asking for reinforcements. Grant did something different. He ordered the army to march south, toward Richmond, deeper into Confederate territory. When the men realized they were not retreating but advancing, they cheered. Lincoln received the news at the War Department telegraph office, where he spent so many hours during the war, waiting for dispatches, pacing, reading, worrying. The telegram told him that Grant was pressing on despite his losses. Lincoln's response, recorded by those present, was immediate and visceral. "How near we have been to this thing before and failed. I believe if any other general had been at the head of that army, it would now have been on this side of the Rapidan." He meant, Grant is a wrestler. Grant stays in contact. Grant does not let go. The parallel extends beyond metaphor. The physical habits of the wrestler, the constant readjustment, the sensitivity to shifts in balance and pressure, the ability to turn an opponent's strength into weakness, these are also the habits of Lincoln's politics. Watch him manage his cabinet, that fractious collection of rivals and egos, each man convinced he should be president instead. Seward at State, ambitious and patronizing, eventually becoming Lincoln's closest advisor. Chase at Treasury, perpetually scheming for the presidency, perpetually underestimating the man he served. Stanton at War, brilliant and brutal, openly contemptuous of Lincoln's storytelling and meandering style. Blair at Navy, unreconstructed conservative, uncomfortable with emancipation. These men fought with each other constantly. They fought with Lincoln sometimes. They leaked to the press, plotted with congressmen, threatened resignation, demanded changes in policy and personnel. Lincoln managed them the way a wrestler manages an opponent's weight. He gave ground where it did not matter. He stood firm where it did. He used their conflicts with each other to prevent any one of them from becoming powerful enough to control him. He let them believe sometimes that they were winning, that they had forced him to change course. And then they would look up and discover that somehow they had ended up where he wanted them to be all along. Seward, who had expected to dominate the administration, who had written a memorandum in the first weeks suggesting that he essentially take over the executive functions of government, eventually became Lincoln's most loyal defender. Chase, who schemed and maneuvered for years to replace Lincoln on the Republican ticket, was outflanked at every turn. His supporters co-opted, his momentum stalled, until finally Lincoln accepted his resignation and then, in a move that still astonishes, appointed him Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, where he could do good work and pose no further political threat. Even Stanton, who had once called Lincoln a long-armed ape and refused to meet with him when they were both private citizens, became so devoted by the end that his vigil at the deathbed was one of the most emotional in that crowded room. What they learned, all of them, was that the shambling storyteller who seemed to make decisions by indirection and delay was in fact the most formidable political operator most of them would ever encounter. His apparent weaknesses, the folksy manner, the endless anecdotes, the refusal to speak with precision about his intentions, were not weaknesses at all. They were techniques. They created uncertainty in his opponent's minds. They bought him time. They allowed him to preserve options while others committed themselves to positions that would later prove untenable. They were, in the vocabulary of wrestling, setups, movements that seemed to be going one direction but were in fact preparation for a move in another direction entirely. Consider the question of Reconstruction. How the rebellious states would be brought back into the Union once the war was won. From 1863 onward, this question dominated political debate in Washington. The radical Republicans in Congress wanted harsh terms. They wanted Confederate leaders punished. They wanted black suffrage guaranteed. They wanted the social order of the South dismantled and rebuilt along egalitarian lines. The conservative Republicans and Northern Democrats wanted rapid reconciliation. They wanted white Southern leaders restored to power. They wanted minimal disruption to the racial hierarchy. They wanted, in essence, reunion without revolution. Lincoln threaded between these positions for 2 years, making commitments to neither, offering plans that satisfied no one completely, allowing the debate to rage while he focused on the more immediate problem of winning the war. His 10% plan, announced in December 1863, was moderate enough to enrage the radicals and lenient enough to worry the conservatives. He pocketed the Wade-Davis bill, Congress's more stringent alternative, rather than signing it, angering the radicals further. He spoke of black suffrage tentatively, experimentally, never committing to a firm position. He met with black leaders, he met with Southern representatives, he talked with everyone and promised nothing that he was not prepared to deliver. By the time of his death, his Reconstruction policy remained genuinely uncertain. Historians have debated ever since what he would have done had he lived. Would he have moved toward the radicals' vision, as his final speech suggested? Would he have compromised with the moderates, as his political instincts often led him to do? Would he have found some third path, some synthesis that no one else could see? The question cannot be answered because Lincoln never had to answer it. He preserved his options until the very end. He stayed in contact without committing his weight. He was still wrestling when the bullet found him. The physical Lincoln and the political Lincoln were the same Lincoln. The body that had thrown Jack Armstrong was the body that absorbed the shocks of 4 years of war. The mind that had calculated leverage on a patch of grass in New Salem was the mind that calculated leverage in the corridors of power. The patience that had let him circle an opponent for long minutes, waiting for the opening, was the patience that let him endure McClellan's delays, Chase's scheming, the drumbeat of criticism from press and Congress and his own party. The competitive fire that had driven a young man to test himself against the best wrestlers in central Illinois was the fire that drove a middle-aged president to demand that his generals fight, that they press the advantage, that they finish the work. And the losses mattered too. The single recorded defeat against Lorenzo Dow Thompson, Lincoln's honest acknowledgement that he had been beaten, his refusal to let his men claim a draw, this was also part of who he was. He knew what it felt like to lose. He knew that losing did not destroy you, that you could be thrown and still get up, that the man who lost one match could win the next. This knowledge, earned in the body, carried over into the spirit. When the war went badly, when the casualty list came in, when the elections turned against him, when it seemed that all his efforts had been in vain, Lincoln did not break. He grieved. He raged sometimes in private. But he got up. He kept wrestling. The last photograph was taken on April 10, 1865, 5 days before his death. It shows a face so exhausted, so hollowed by suffering, that it barely seems to belong to a living man. The eyes are distant. The skin hangs slack. The famous mole on the right cheek stands out against flesh that has lost its underlying vitality. He was 56 years old. He looked 80. The war had consumed him, not quickly, not all at once, but piece by piece, year by year, death by death. 620,000 dead by the war's end, perhaps more. Each one a weight added to the burden, each one a line etched deeper into that asymmetrical face. But there is something else in that photograph, if you look long enough. A stillness that is not merely exhaustion, a quiet that is not merely defeat. The war was ending. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox the day before. The work was nearly finished. And Lincoln, who had held the Union together through sheer force of will, who had found generals and fired generals and found them again, who had written the words that transformed the war from a struggle for union into a struggle for freedom, who had walked the halls of the White House at night unable to sleep, haunted by dreams and premonitions, Lincoln, at last, could begin to imagine what came next. He would not live to see it. But in that final photograph, taken when the long wrestle was almost over, there is something that looks almost like peace. The boarding house where he died still stands, though the bed has been replaced and the room reconstructed. Ford's Theater reopened as a performance space a century after the assassination, and tourists now watch plays in the same auditorium where the shot was fired. The presidential box has been draped to look as it did that night. the rocking chair positioned where Lincoln sat, the portrait of Washington hanging above. It is strange to sit in that theater, to watch actors move across the stage, to look up at the box and imagine the door opening, the figure entering, the arm extending with the pistol. The acoustics have not changed. The sight lines have not changed. What has changed is everything else. The nation Lincoln saved, the freedom he died helping to secure, the questions about race and justice and union that he left for subsequent generations to answer. They did not answer them. Not fully. Not in the way Lincoln might have hoped. The bullet that entered his skull behind the left ear traveled through his brain at an angle, lodging behind his right eye. He never regained consciousness. The doctors who attended him that night, there were several, drawn from the audience and from nearby military hospitals, knew within minutes that the wound was mortal. They could do nothing but keep him comfortable, keep the blood from pooling, keep vigil through the long hours until the body released what remained of the man who had inhabited it. He died at 7:22 in the morning on April 15, 1865. The room in the Peterson house was crowded with cabinet members, generals, senators, and his eldest son, Robert. Mary Lincoln had been taken to another room, her grief too violent to witness. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton stood at the bedside. According to witnesses, when the breathing finally stopped, Stanton said something. The exact words are disputed. Some heard, "Now he belongs to the ages." Others heard, "Now he belongs to the angels." The difference is small but significant. Ages suggests history. Angels suggests heaven. Stanton may have meant both, or neither, or something else entirely that memory and repetition have transformed. What is certain is this: the man was dead, and the country he had held together was suddenly without the one figure who had seemed capable of holding it. The immediate aftermath was chaos laced with ritual. Within hours, Andrew Johnson was sworn in as president. Within days, John Wilkes Booth was tracked to a Virginia tobacco barn and shot dead by a Union sergeant. Within weeks, the conspirators were tried by military tribunal, and 4 of them were hanged in the courtyard of the old Arsenal Penitentiary in Washington. The gallows had been built the night before. The ropes had been tested with weights. The condemned stood on the platform in the July heat, hoods drawn over their faces, and then the supports were knocked away, and they fell. Mary Surratt became the first woman executed by the federal government. Her guilt remains debated to this day. But the real chaos was longer and slower and less visible. It was the chaos of a nation that had won a war and did not know what winning meant: Reconstruction. The word itself suggests something mechanical, as if the country were a broken machine that merely needed to be reassembled. In practice, it was nothing of the kind. It was a struggle over the fundamental meaning of American citizenship, over who would have power in the defeated South, over whether the 4 million people freed from slavery would become full participants in the democracy Lincoln had died to preserve. Lincoln himself had begun to sketch a plan. In his second inaugural, he had called for binding up the nation's wounds, for charity toward all and malice toward none. In his final public address, delivered from a White House window 3 days before his death, he had suggested that at least some black men, those who had served in the Union Army, those who were educated, should be given the right to vote. It was a tentative suggestion, hedged with qualifications, but it was more than any American president had ever said in public. John Wilkes Booth was in the crowd that night. He turned to a companion and said, "That means nigger citizenship. That is the last speech he will ever give." 3 days later, he made good on his threat. And so the question of what Lincoln would have done, what kind of reconstruction he would have built, what compromises he would have made, what principled stands he would have taken, remains one of the great unanswerable questions of American history. The man who might have known how to navigate the peace did not live to navigate it. The man who replaced him, Andrew Johnson, a former Democrat from Tennessee, a man who had owned slaves, a man who believed in the Union, but not in racial equality, had neither the skill nor the inclination to pursue Lincoln's vision. The 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery, was ratified in December 1865. The 14th, establishing birthright citizenship and equal protection under the law, followed in 1868. The 15th, prohibiting the denial of voting rights on the basis of race, came in 1870. These were Lincoln's amendments, in a sense, the legal architecture of a new nation that his war had made possible, even if he did not live to see them written. But the story of Reconstruction is also the story of how that architecture was undermined, resisted, and eventually abandoned. It is the story of the Ku Klux Klan and the Red Shirts, of systematic violence against black voters and office holders. It is the story of sharecropping and convict leasing, of new forms of bondage that replaced the old. It is the story of the Compromise of 1877, when federal troops were withdrawn from the South in exchange for a contested presidential election, and the protections Lincoln had fought for were left to the mercy of state governments that had no interest in protecting them. For nearly a century afterward, the gains of Reconstruction were reversed. Segregation became law. Voting rights were stripped away through poll taxes and literacy tests and grandfather clauses. Lynching became a form of social control, a public spectacle of terror that claimed thousands of lives. The country Lincoln had saved became, in practice, two countries, one where the Constitution's promises applied and one where they did not. And yet the words remained, the amendments remained, the Gettysburg Address remained, the second inaugural remained. The legal and moral architecture that Lincoln had helped to build could be suppressed, but not erased. It was there, waiting, when the moment came to invoke it again. When Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat in Montgomery in 1955, she was claiming rights that the 14th Amendment had promised her nearly a century before. When Martin Luther King Jr. stood at the Lincoln Memorial in 1963 and spoke of a promissory note that America had defaulted on, he was explicitly invoking Lincoln's legacy, standing in the shadow of the man who had written the words that gave the march its moral force. When Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, he was completing work that had been abandoned in 1877, work that Lincoln had begun with a proclamation written in a quiet study in the White House, while the war still raged and the outcome remained uncertain. The story is not over. The story is never over. That is perhaps the central fact of Lincoln's legacy, that the questions he raised, the ideals he articulated, the contradictions he embodied, are still being worked out in the present day. Every debate about voting rights, about equal protection, about who belongs and who does not, is in some sense a continuation of the conversation Lincoln began. Every attempt to suppress the franchise, every gerrymander, every effort to narrow the meaning of citizenship is an attempt to answer his questions differently than he answered them. He did not resolve the contradictions. He could not have. The country he led was too divided, the wounds too deep, the hatreds too entrenched. What he did was hold the space open, keep the Union intact long enough for the work to continue, write the words clearly enough that future generations could not pretend not to understand them, die at the moment when his death could not undo what he had built. There is a school of historical thought that says great men do not make history, that history makes them, that the forces of economics and demography and technology would have produced the same outcomes regardless of who happened to be standing in the right place at the right time. There is some truth in this. Lincoln did not cause the Civil War. The tensions that produced it had been building for generations before his birth. The industrial North and the agricultural South were on a collision course that no individual could have prevented. But the fact that the collision was inevitable does not mean the outcome was inevitable. History is full of moments where things could have gone differently, where the Union might have fractured permanently, where the Confederacy might have achieved independence, where slavery might have persisted for decades longer. Lincoln was not the only possible president, but he was the one who held. He was the one who found the words. He was the one who endured. And this brings us back, finally, to the body. The body that wrestled on the grass at New Salem, the body that split rails and poled flatboats and walked the dusty roads of central Illinois, the body that grew so tall and so thin that it seemed almost ungainly, almost comical, until you saw it in motion and understood that the length of those arms and the reach of those legs were advantages, not deficits. The physical culture of the frontier shaped him. This is easy to forget when we contemplate him in bronze, draped in the garments of statecraft, frozen in postures of solemn deliberation. But Lincoln was an animal before he was a symbol. He ate and slept and suffered and struggled. He felt pain in his body. He felt the satisfaction of physical contest, the exhaustion after a long match, the particular pleasure of having tested himself against a worthy opponent and come out ahead. Historians have noted that wrestling was one of the few activities that seemed to bring him genuine joy in his youth. The melancholy that would shadow his entire life, the periodic depressions that left him unable to function, the dreams and premonitions that haunted his nights, these were already present in the young man at New Salem, already part of his mental landscape. But when he wrestled, the darkness lifted. The body was doing something it understood. The mind could rest. There is something important here about the relationship between the physical and the mental, between the body's knowledge and the mind's torment. Lincoln was a man of words, perhaps the greatest writer ever to hold the presidency, capable of producing sentences that still resonate more than a century and a half after his death. But he was also a man of action, a man who understood that words without the will to enforce them were merely breath. The same hands that held the pen that signed the Emancipation Proclamation had once gripped the collar of Jack Armstrong on a patch of Illinois dirt. The same mind that composed the Gettysburg Address had once calculated angles of leverage and balance, looking for the opening that would let him throw his opponent to the ground. The wrestling was not separate from the greatness, it was part of it. Consider the qualities that made Lincoln a great wrestler. Patience, the willingness to circle, to wait, to let the opponent make the first mistake, physical awareness, the knowledge of his own body's capabilities and limitations, adaptability, the ability to adjust technique based on the opponent, side holds for one man, collar and elbow for another, mental toughness, the capacity to keep fighting when exhausted, to recover from setbacks, to refuse to quit until the match was decided. These are also the qualities that made him a great president: the patience to wait for the right moment to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, the awareness of his own political position and the constraints it imposed, the adaptability to work with generals he despised, to negotiate with congressmen who hated him, to adjust his strategy as the war evolved, the mental toughness to endure loss after loss, military losses, political losses, personal losses, and continue to function. The frontier did not make him gentle. The wrestling did not make him kind. Whatever gentleness and kindness he possessed came from somewhere else, from his mother, perhaps, who died when he was 9, from his stepmother, who recognized something in the awkward boy and encouraged him to read, from some innate orientation toward mercy that no amount of hardship could extinguish. But the frontier did make him strong. The wrestling did make him capable. And when the time came to exercise both strength and capability in the service of a cause larger than himself, he was ready. The statue in the memorial shows him seated. It is the only major Lincoln monument that presents him this way. Not standing, not striding forward, not pointing toward the future, but sitting in a great stone chair, hands resting on the armrests, eyes looking out over the reflecting pool toward the Washington Monument in the distance. The effect is one of profound exhaustion and profound peace. He has finished the work. He can rest. But there is something else in that seated figure, something the sculptor Daniel Chester French may or may not have intended. The posture is wrong for a man who has simply given up. The hands are not limp. The spine is not collapsed. If you look carefully, you can see tension in the forearms, weight in the shoulders. He is sitting, but he is not finished. He is waiting. He is ready. The memorial was dedicated in 1922, 57 years after Lincoln's death. The principal speaker at the dedication was Robert Russa Moton, the president of Tuskegee Institute, the institution that Booker T. Washington had built. Moton was a black man speaking at a ceremony honoring the man who had freed his ancestors. But the ceremony itself was segregated. Black attendees were seated in a separate section, roped off from the white audience. The contradiction was not lost on anyone who cared to notice it. 41 years later, Martin Luther King Jr. would stand on the steps of that same memorial and deliver his most famous speech. The segregation ropes were gone. The crowd was integrated. But the work was still unfinished. The arc of the moral universe, King said, bends toward justice, but it bends slowly and only when people force it to bend. Lincoln would have understood this. He was not a man who believed in easy victories or simple solutions. He knew that the good was always fighting the good enough, that the perfect was the enemy of the possible, that you sometimes had to accept half a loaf while continuing to work for the whole. He had lived this knowledge in his body on the wrestling grounds of Central Illinois, where you did not always throw your opponent cleanly, where sometimes you had to settle for a draw, where sometimes you simply had to acknowledge that you had been beaten and wait for the next match. The match is still going on. Walk through the streets of Springfield, Illinois today, and you will find a city that has made peace with its most famous resident. The Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum dominates the downtown, its exhibits tracing his life from the Kentucky cabin to Ford's Theater. His law office has been preserved, his home has been preserved. The old state capitol where he delivered the House-divided speech has been preserved. Tourists come from around the world to walk the same streets he walked, to stand in the same rooms he stood in, to feel some connection to the man who rose from obscurity to save a nation. But there is something the tourists cannot quite reach. The essential Lincoln, the man behind the legend, the body behind the bronze, remains elusive. We know what he did. We know what he said. We know what he looked like and how he dressed and what jokes he told. But we do not know what it felt like to be him. We do not know the weight of those decisions as they were being made, the texture of those sleepless nights, the particular flavor of his grief when his son died, his soldiers died, his country bled. We have his words, and his words are extraordinary. But words are not the same as experience. The man who wrote the Gettysburg Address also stood on that battlefield 3 days after the fighting ended, when the dead were still being buried and the smell of decomposing flesh hung heavy in the air. The man who wrote the second inaugural also walked through Richmond the day after it fell, surrounded by newly freed people who reached out to touch him, some of them weeping, some of them calling him Father Abraham. The man who composed the letter to Mrs. Bixby, expressing condolences for the loss of her 5 sons in battle, also knew that the words, however beautiful, could not bring those sons back to life. The gap between language and reality is one of the great themes of Lincoln's life. He was a master of words, and he knew better than anyone how inadequate words could be. The silence that witnesses described in the White House after Willie died, the long, dark days when Lincoln seemed unable to speak at all, this silence was also a kind of eloquence. Some things could not be said. Some losses could not be articulated. The body knew this even when the mind kept trying to find the right phrase, and the body, in the end, gave out. The body that had wrestled 300 matches, or a dozen, or some number in between, the body that had carried him through prairie winters and political campaigns and 4 years of civil war, could not survive an ounce of lead fired from 8 feet away. The flesh that had seemed so vital, so tough, so resilient, was just flesh after all. It could be torn, it could bleed, it could stop. The funeral train carried him home to Illinois, retracing the journey he had made 4 years earlier when he left Springfield for Washington. At every stop along the way, Philadelphia, New York, Cleveland, Chicago, crowds gathered to see the coffin, to pay their respects, to mourn. The estimates vary, but millions of Americans saw the funeral procession in one form or another. Many of them had never seen Lincoln in life. Now they saw him in death, or rather, they saw the elaborate catafalque, the draped locomotives, the honor guards, the symbolic machinery of national grief. The coffin was opened at several stops along the route. Embalmers had done what they could, but the body was deteriorating. By the time the train reached Springfield, the face that had been photographed so many times was nearly unrecognizable. The decay was evident. The flesh had darkened. The features had begun to collapse. He was buried in Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield on May 4th, 1865. The tomb there now is a massive structure of granite and bronze, rebuilt and expanded several times over the decades. His wife Mary is buried beside him, along with 3 of their 4 sons. Robert, the eldest, who witnessed his father's death, who later served as Secretary of War and Ambassador to Britain, chose to be buried elsewhere, at Arlington National Cemetery among the soldiers his father had commanded. The tomb at Oak Ridge is not the original structure. The first version was far simpler, a modest vault where the body was placed on the day of burial, while something grander could be designed. And in the years that followed, Lincoln's remains would be moved no fewer than 17 times. 17 different resting places within the cemetery grounds, as the tomb was built, rebuilt, renovated, and secured against threats both real and imagined. The threats were not imaginary. In November of 1876, 11 years after the assassination, a group of counterfeiters hatched a plan to steal Lincoln's body. Their scheme was almost absurdly straightforward. They would break into the tomb, remove the coffin, transport it to the Indiana sand dunes 200 miles away, and bury it in secret. Then, they would demand a ransom of $200,000 in gold and the release of their imprisoned associate, a master engraver named Benjamin Boyd, whose counterfeiting skills had been essential to their operation. Without Boyd, their business was failing. With Lincoln's corpse as leverage, they believed they could get him back. The conspirators were a ragged crew, saloon keepers, petty criminals, men who had drifted into counterfeiting because legitimate work seemed either too hard or too honest. They scouted the cemetery, they acquired tools, they set a date, the night of November 7th, 1876, election night, when the nation's attention would be fixed elsewhere. What they did not know was that the Secret Service had infiltrated their ring. An informant named Louis Sweigels, a small-time criminal who had agreed to work with federal agents in exchange for leniency, was present at every planning meeting. He reported everything. On the night of the attempted theft, the counterfeiters broke the padlock on the tomb's outer door. They filed through the lock on the marble sarcophagus. They managed to slide the cedar coffin partway out before the agents, waiting in the darkness of the cemetery, moved in to make their arrest. But here the plan failed on both sides. The agents, expecting the conspirators to be armed, held back too long. The counterfeiters fled into the night. It took 10 days to track them down, hiding in Chicago. They were eventually convicted, not of attempted body snatching, which was surprisingly not a crime in Illinois at the time, but of damaging the tomb's lock. The sentence was 1 year in prison. The incident shook the Lincoln family and the custodians of the tomb. For years afterward, the coffin was hidden in various locations within the cemetery, in a shallow grave in the basement, behind a pile of lumber, beneath a layer of dirt. A group of Springfield citizens formed a secret society called the Lincoln Guard of Honor, sworn to protect the body's location. Only a handful of people knew where the remains actually lay at any given time. The secrecy lasted until 1901, when Robert Lincoln finally authorized a permanent solution. The coffin was placed in a steel cage, lowered into a vault 10 feet below the floor of the tomb, and encased in several tons of concrete. It has not been moved since. The body that wrestled Jack Armstrong in a clearing outside New Salem, that split rails and walked circuit courts and debated Stephen Douglas in towns across Illinois, that stood on the battlefield at Gettysburg and walked through the ruins of Richmond. That body now lies beneath concrete and stone, unreachable, preserved against the strange hungers of history. But the memory of the body, what it meant, what it did, what it represented, that proved far more difficult to contain. Within weeks of the assassination, the transformation had already begun. The man was becoming the myth. Sermons preached on Easter Sunday 1865 drew explicit parallels between Lincoln and Christ. Both killed on Good Friday, both martyred for their people's sins, both called to bear the weight of a nation's redemption. The comparison was irresistible, and preachers across the North made it without hesitation. Lincoln had died that the Union might live. Lincoln had given his life to free the slaves. Lincoln had been taken from his people at the moment of victory, ascending from the earthly struggle to some higher reward. The language was religious because the loss felt religious. The scale of the mourning was unlike anything the nation had experienced before, not just grief for a political leader, but something closer to collective trauma, a wound that seemed to reach into every household that had lost a son or brother or father to the war. Lincoln's death was their loss crystallized, made visible, made single. He had become, in a sense, all of them. And so the mythology that grew up around him served a purpose that mere biography could not. It gave shape to feelings that had no other form. But mythology is a dangerous lens. It magnifies some things and erases others. The Lincoln who emerged in the decades after his death was often a Lincoln stripped of his contradictions, his doubts, his pragmatic calculations, the very qualities that had made him effective in life. He became the great emancipator, the savior of the Union, the rail splitter who rose from poverty to greatness through sheer moral virtue. Each of these images contained truth. None of them contained the whole truth. The great emancipator narrative, for example, was both accurate and incomplete. Lincoln did issue the Emancipation Proclamation. He did push for the 13th Amendment. He did, in the end, embrace the cause of abolition with something approaching moral conviction. But the path to that embrace was neither straight nor inevitable. In his debates with Douglas in 1858, Lincoln had explicitly stated that he did not believe in the social and political equality of the races, that he had never been in favor of making voters or jurors of black people, that there was a physical difference between the races that would forever forbid them from living together on terms of perfect equality. These words are in the transcripts. They are not forgeries or misquotations. They are what Lincoln said in public to win votes in a state where racism was the common currency of political discourse. Does this erase the Emancipation Proclamation? Of course not. Does the proclamation erase those earlier statements? Of course not. Both are part of the same life, the same mind, the same evolving understanding. The Lincoln of 1858 was not the Lincoln of 1865. People change, circumstances change, and one of the most remarkable things about Lincoln was his capacity for growth, his willingness to revise his thinking when events demanded it. But the mythology preferred a simpler story, the man who always knew what was right and simply waited for the moment to act. This version was inspirational. It was also false. Similarly, the rail splitter narrative, while grounded in fact, Lincoln really did split rails as a young man, really did grow up in poverty, really did achieve the presidency without wealth or family connections, flattened the complexity of his actual journey. By the time he reached Washington, Lincoln was a prosperous lawyer who had represented railroad companies, banks, and major corporations. He had married into one of Kentucky's most prominent families. He owned real estate. He was, by the standards of mid-19th century America, firmly upper middle class. The log cabin was real, but it was also 30 years in the past. The man who entered the White House was no longer the boy who had slept on a dirt floor in Indiana. He had remade himself, as ambitious Americans often did, and the remaking involved not just character, but circumstance, not just virtue, but opportunity. None of this diminishes Lincoln's achievement. If anything, it makes the achievement more remarkable, not less. A man born into genuine poverty, with less than a year of formal schooling, educated himself through sheer determination, navigated the brutal politics of antebellum Illinois, and rose to lead a nation through its greatest crisis. That story does not need embellishment. It does not need simplification. It is extraordinary on its own terms, but the mythmakers could not leave it alone. The wrestling legend followed the same trajectory. In the years after Lincoln's death, the story of his matches, particularly the contest with Jack Armstrong, became part of the standard biographical apparatus, repeated in countless biographies, children's books, and commemorative speeches. The details varied. Sometimes Lincoln won decisively. Sometimes the match ended in a draw. Sometimes Armstrong cheated, grabbing Lincoln below the waist or using illegal holds, and Lincoln threw him down in righteous anger. Sometimes the two men simply fought to exhaustion and parted as friends. The Clary's Grove Boys, in some versions, threatened violence when their champion fell. In others, they immediately accepted Lincoln as one of their own. The number of witnesses grew with each retelling. The stakes of the match expanded. What had been a village scuffle became a defining moment, a proof of character, a prophecy of future greatness. By the time Lincoln was inducted into the National Wrestling Hall of Fame in 1992, the narrative had calcified into something resembling official history. The 300 matches, the single loss to Lorenzo Dow Thompson, the legendary strength and technique, all of it passed down through generations of retellings, each one adding a layer of polish to the original rough-hewn facts. Historians have done what historians do. They have gone back to the primary sources, such as they are, and tried to separate the documented from the embroidered. The results are humbling. There are, in fact, very few contemporary accounts of Lincoln's wrestling career. Most of what we think we know comes from reminiscences collected decades after the fact, when Lincoln was already famous or already dead, when the temptation to inflate one's connection to greatness would have been overwhelming. The match with Armstrong is mentioned in several sources, but the details conflict. The match with Thompson is even more obscure, a single account passed through multiple hands with no corroborating evidence. This does not mean the wrestling never happened. It almost certainly did. Lincoln's physical prowess was too widely attested by too many independent sources to be mere invention. His height, his reach, his strength, these are documented. His reputation in New Salem as a formidable grappler seems to have been genuine. But the specific numbers, 300 matches, 1 loss, 12 years of competition, these are harder to verify. They may be roughly accurate, they may be wildly inflated. The sources do not permit certainty. What the sources do permit is a more modest but perhaps more interesting conclusion, that wrestling mattered to Lincoln not as a hobby or a pastime, but as a formative experience. The frontier valued physical strength because physical strength was useful. It helped with labor. It helped with survival. It conferred respect in communities where formal credentials were scarce, and a man was judged by what he could do with his hands and his body. Lincoln's wrestling gave him standing in New Salem, a kind of credibility that no amount of book learning could have provided on its own. It also gave him practice at a certain kind of competition, direct, physical, bounded by unwritten rules that both parties understood. The handshake after the match, the acceptance of defeat, the refusal to hold grudges, these lessons transferred. The political Lincoln, the lawyering Lincoln, the debating Lincoln, all of them displayed qualities that might have been honed on those dusty clearings where two men locked arms and tried to throw each other to the ground. The willingness to engage opponents directly, the patience to wait for an opening, the capacity to absorb punishment and keep fighting, the grace in loss, the lack of gloating in victory. It is too neat, perhaps, to draw a straight line from wrestling matches in New Salem to the presidency. Too tempting to turn correlation into causation, to make the body's lessons into the mind's curriculum. But the temptation persists because the connection feels real. The Lincoln who wrestled Jack Armstrong and the Lincoln who debated Stephen Douglas were not two different men. They were the same man in different contexts, using different skills, pursuing the same fundamental goal: to be recognized, to be respected, to win. The body, though, always the body. We return to it because Lincoln's physical presence was so unusual, so impossible to ignore, that contemporaries could not stop describing it. 6 feet 4 inches tall in an era when the average American man stood 5'7". Long arms, disproportionately long even for his height, giving him an ape-like appearance that his enemies loved to caricature. Large hands, large feet, a chest so narrow that some observers thought him almost frail despite his height. A face that photographers struggled to capture, craggy, asymmetrical, the left side slightly different from the right, a face that could look profoundly sad in one image and almost mischievous in another. He moved awkwardly, by most accounts. His gait was described as shambling, loose-jointed, as if his limbs were not quite under his control. He sat in chairs with his knees higher than seemed comfortable, folding his long legs beneath him or extending them across half a room. He had a high-pitched voice that carried surprisingly well, cutting through crowds with an edge that deeper voices could not match. He dressed carelessly, his clothes often wrinkled, his hat often crushed, his collars often askew. He looked, in short, nothing like a president was supposed to look. And yet the body worked. It worked in wrestling matches where the reach and the strength compensated for whatever clumsiness there might have been. It worked on the campaign trail where the sheer memorable quality of his appearance, the homely face, the towering height, the rumpled clothes, made him impossible to forget. It worked in the White House, where foreign dignitaries and cabinet members alike found themselves somehow reassured by the physical presence of this strange, sad, funny man who seemed to have been assembled from spare parts. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, like so many Lincoln stories, but persistent, about a European visitor who was granted an audience with the president during the war. The visitor had expected to meet a statesman, a dignitary, a figure of impressive bearing. Instead, he found Lincoln sprawled in a chair, his feet on a desk, telling jokes to a group of advisors. The visitor was appalled. This was the leader of the American Republic, this ungainly, ill-dressed, joke-telling person? But as the meeting progressed, as Lincoln turned to the serious business at hand, the visitor's opinion shifted. There was something about the man that commanded attention, something beyond the physical awkwardness, beyond the informality, beyond the appearance, a quality of mind that emerged slowly but unmistakably, revealing itself in the precision of his questions, the depth of his understanding, the sudden flashes of insight that cut through confusion. The body was not an obstacle. It was a disguise. Or perhaps more accurately, it was a kind of disarmament, a way of putting opponents at ease, making them underestimate the mind that lived inside the strange casing. Lincoln had learned, somewhere along the way, that people saw what they expected to see. If they expected a country bumpkin, he would give them a country bumpkin, and then surprise them with the lawyer, the debater, the thinker. If they expected a clown, he would tell jokes, and then deliver a Gettysburg Address. The gap between appearance and reality was itself a kind of strategy, a form of power that operated precisely because it was not recognized as power. The wrestlers on the frontier must have learned this too, that the skinny kid with the long arms might be stronger than he looked, that the man who seemed all elbows and knees might have a grip you could not break. Underestimation is a gift if you know how to use it. There is a photograph, one of the last taken of Lincoln in April 1865, just days before the assassination. He is seated, facing the camera, his face worn beyond its years. The war has aged him visibly. The lines are deeper than they were in 1860. The eyes have a quality that is difficult to describe, not exactly sad, not exactly weary, but something in between, something that is seen more than any single pair of eyes should have to see. In this photograph, Lincoln does not look like a wrestler. He does not look like a rail splitter. He does not look like the young man who arrived in New Salem with nothing but a strong back and a willingness to work. He looks like what he had become, a man who had carried a nation through 4 years of war, who had made decisions that killed hundreds of thousands of people, who had freed millions of enslaved human beings and not yet seen the full consequences of that act, who knew that the work was not done and might never be done, who was tired in a way that sleep could not fix. The body in that photograph would have a week to live. The body that had wrestled Jack Armstrong, that had walked the circuit courts, that had stood on platforms across Illinois debating the fate of the Union. That body would be carried across Pennsylvania Avenue on a stretcher, would lie unconscious through the night in a boarding house bedroom too small to accommodate its length, would finally cease breathing at 7:22 in the morning on April 15, 1865. And then the legend began in earnest. The irony is that Lincoln himself mistrusted legend. He was, by all accounts, a skeptic, raised in a Baptist family but never baptized, never formally a member of any church, uncomfortable with doctrinal certainty. His favorite poet was Shakespeare, who dealt in human complexity rather than divine simplicity. His humor was earthy, deflating, designed to puncture pretension. He called himself ambitious. The word appears in his early writings, but the ambition was always mixed with self-mockery, as if he could see himself from the outside and found the sight both comic and strange. The speeches we remember him by, the Gettysburg Address, the second inaugural, are monuments of American prose, but they are not monuments to Lincoln himself. They point away from the speaker toward the cause, the nation, the dead. Government of the people, by the people, for the people. The famous phrase contains no first-person pronoun. Lincoln is absent from his own most celebrated sentence. This was intentional. This was chosen. The man who could tell a bawdy joke on the campaign trail and reduce a courtroom to laughter, this same man could disappear entirely into the formal requirements of state rhetoric, becoming a vessel for ideas larger than himself. The wrestler who sought individual recognition, who wanted to be known and respected and admired, had somehow learned to subordinate that self to something else. The ego was still there, No one becomes president without a substantial ego, but it had been trained, disciplined, channeled into forms that served purposes beyond itself. This is the Lincoln who resists the mythology. Not the saint, not the martyr, not the great emancipator striding through history toward inevitable triumph, but the man, complicated, evolving, struggling, calculating, capable of cruelty as well as kindness, of political ruthlessness as well as moral growth, the man who suspended habeas corpus and jailed newspaper editors, the man who told racist jokes and held racist views that he slowly, partially, incompletely overcame, the man who preserved the Union by means that would horrify civil libertarians today, the man who freed the slaves through a legal instrument explicitly limited in scope, designed as much for military necessity as for moral right. This Lincoln is harder to love, but he is also perhaps more useful, because he shows us something the mythology cannot, that moral progress is not automatic, that great achievements come from imperfect people, that the work of justice is never finished and never pure. The funeral train left Washington on April 21, 1865, 6 days after Lincoln stopped breathing in that cramped boarding house room. It would take nearly 2 weeks to reach Springfield, traveling a circuitous route through the northern states, through Baltimore, where Lincoln had once slipped through at night to avoid assassination plots, through Philadelphia, where the Declaration of Independence had been signed, through New York, where more than 100,000 people filed past the open casket in City Hall, through Cleveland and Columbus and Indianapolis and Chicago. A slow, mournful procession of 1,654 miles, the longest funeral in American history. At every stop, crowds gathered. At every stop, people wept. The man who had been so divisive in life, so hated by half the country, so mocked and caricatured and threatened, had become in death something approaching sacred. The bullet that killed him had also transformed him. The wrestler from New Salem, the rail splitter, the self-taught lawyer who once admitted he could barely manage the basics of grammar, this man was now a martyr, a symbol, something larger than any mortal life could contain. The train carried 2 coffins, Lincoln's, of course, but also a smaller one, Willie Lincoln, the president's 3rd son, who had died in the White House in 1862 at the age of 11, probably from typhoid fever. Mary Todd Lincoln had been so devastated by the boy's death that she never again entered the room where he died, never again entered the green room where his body had been embalmed. Lincoln himself had visited the boy's crypt in a Washington cemetery multiple times in the years that followed, had the coffin opened so he could look upon his son's face. Now father and son would travel together, one last time, back to the Illinois prairie where the story had begun. The train arrived in Springfield on May 3rd. The body lay in state in the Illinois State House, where Lincoln had once argued cases and delivered speeches and sat through endless legislative sessions. Thousands filed past, some of them people who had known him, who had heard him speak in the early debates, who had voted for or against him in elections stretching back decades. Some of them may even have remembered the stories, the wrestling, the rail splitting, the flatboat trips down the Mississippi, the living memories that would die with them. He was buried on May 4, 1865, in Oak Ridge Cemetery, on a hillside overlooking the prairie. The grave was modest at first. The elaborate tomb would come later, built by subscription from a grieving nation. But on that first day, as the coffin was lowered into the Illinois earth, what remained of Abraham Lincoln was simply a body. 66 years old, 6 feet 4 inches, long arms, long legs, hands that had once gripped and twisted and thrown. The earth did not remember. The prairie grass would grow over, the winter would come and cover everything in snow. And slowly, inevitably, the man would be replaced by the monument. But here's the thing about monuments. They cast shadows. The Lincoln who entered American memory after April 1865 was not quite the Lincoln who had lived. He was better. He was simpler. He was what the nation needed him to be at the moment of its greatest trauma. A suffering Christ figure, a democratic saint, the conscience of America made flesh and then martyred for its sins. The fact that he had been killed on Good Friday only deepened the religious resonance. Sermons across the country drew the parallel explicitly. Lincoln had died so that the nation might live. His blood had washed away the stain of slavery. This mythology was not entirely wrong. It captured something true about Lincoln's significance, the magnitude of his accomplishments, the depth of his sacrifice, the moral stakes of the war he had prosecuted. But it also obscured something equally true, that Lincoln was a product of his time as much as a transcendent force, that his views on race evolved but never fully escaped the prejudices of his era, that his wartime measures included the suspension of fundamental civil liberties, that his famous magnanimity toward the South, with malice toward none, with charity for all, might have produced a reconstruction far less transformative than what was actually needed. The historian Lerone Bennett Jr. wrote a controversial book in 2000 called Forced into Glory, arguing that Lincoln was not the great emancipator of legend, but rather a reluctant liberator who moved toward abolition only when military necessity demanded it. Bennett's thesis was extreme, rejected by most Lincoln scholars, but it pointed to something genuine, the gap between the mythology and the man, between what we needed Lincoln to be and what he actually was. The most honest assessment might be this: Lincoln was great because he grew, not because he was born enlightened, not because he saw clearly from the beginning, but because he was capable of changing his mind when confronted with evidence, of evolving his position when events demanded it, of subordinating his personal prejudices to the requirements of justice, imperfectly, incompletely, but genuinely. The man who said in 1858 that he had no purpose to introduce political and social equality between the white and black races was not the same man who, in 1864, advocated for voting rights for black soldiers and educated freedmen. Something had changed. Something had moved. The war had taught him, or perhaps the war had simply revealed what had always been latent, a capacity for moral growth that is rarer than we might wish. This is the Lincoln worth remembering. Not the marble statue on the National Mall staring impassively into the reflecting pool. Not the face on the penny stylized beyond recognition, but the man in motion, the man capable of being wrong and then becoming less wrong, the man who started somewhere and ended somewhere else. And what of the wrestling? It faded, of course, into the background of the larger story. By the time Lincoln was president, the matches in New Salem were ancient history, 30 years in the past, fragments of a life that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. When journalists and biographers sought to reconstruct Lincoln's early years, the wrestling episodes surfaced as local color, as evidence of frontier vigor, as proof that the cerebral lawyer-politician had once been a man of physical strength. But the deeper significance was rarely explored. Perhaps there is a reason for that. Perhaps the connection between the wrestler and the president is harder to articulate than it first appears. Perhaps the journey from the grass at New Salem to the executive mansion at Washington is so vast, so discontinuous, so improbable, that any attempt to draw a straight line seems forced. The young man who pinned Hank Thompson had nothing in common with the old man who signed the Emancipation Proclamation. They were different people, living different lives in different worlds. And yet, there is something in the wrestling that persists, something that the later Lincoln carried with him, even if he never spoke of it directly. The willingness to engage, the refusal to back down, the understanding that some disputes cannot be resolved through words alone, that sometimes you have to step into the ring and see who is stronger. The presidency was a kind of wrestling match, 4 years of it, grappling with generals who would not fight, grappling with politicians who wanted compromise at any cost, grappling with abolitionists who thought he moved too slowly, grappling with racists who thought he moved too fast, grappling with his own cabinet, with his own party, with his own conscience. The body was older, the stakes unimaginably higher, but the fundamental posture was the same. Set your feet. Wait for the other man to commit. Look for the opening. And when you see it, move. Lincoln lost that match exactly once, on the night of April 14, 1865. He went to the theater when he should have stayed home. He dismissed his guard when he should have kept him close. He sat in the dark, watching a play he had seen before, and did not notice the man with the derringer creeping up behind him. John Wilkes Booth was an actor, a Confederate sympathizer. a man who believed he was striking a blow for a cause already defeated. He had originally planned to kidnap Lincoln to hold him hostage in exchange for Confederate prisoners. When the war ended, when Lee surrendered at Appomattox, the plan shifted. Kidnapping was pointless now, but murder might still mean something. Murder might make Booth immortal. He was right in a way. His name endures. But it endures as a footnote to the man he killed, a parasite on Lincoln's legend, the assassin who made the martyr. There's a photograph of Lincoln taken on April 10, 1865, 4 days before the shooting. It is the last photograph of him alive. He stands on the balcony of the White House, looking down at a crowd celebrating the end of the war. Lee had surrendered the day before. The long nightmare was over, or seemed to be. Richmond had fallen. The Confederacy was collapsing. 4 years of slaughter were finally coming to an end. In the photograph, Lincoln's face is tired but calm. He has aged 20 years in 4. The hair is grayer, the lines deeper, the hollows beneath the eyes more pronounced. But there is something else in that face, something that might be relief, or might be exhaustion so profound that it looks like peace. He gave a speech that night from a window of the White House. It was not one of his great orations. It dealt mostly with the practical challenges of Reconstruction, the question of voting rights for freedmen, the complexities of readmitting rebel states to the Union. But it contained one line that would prove prophetic. He spoke of the need to bind up the nation's wounds, a phrase he had used before in the second inaugural and would not live to act upon. In the crowd that night, listening from the White House lawn, stood John Wilkes Booth. That means citizenship, Booth said to his companion when Lincoln mentioned voting rights for black soldiers. Now, by God, I'll put him through. That is the last speech he will ever give. 3 days later, it was. The body was carried back to the Peterson House across the street from Ford's Theater. A boarding house, a rented room, a bed too short for his frame. They had to lay him diagonally across it, his feet hanging off the end. The doctors gathered. The cabinet ministers gathered. Mary Todd Lincoln wept in an adjoining room, her cries audible through the walls. Robert Lincoln, the eldest son, stood watch through the night. At 7:22 in the morning, the breathing stopped. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, standing at the bedside, is said to have spoken the words that history would remember. Now he belongs to the ages. Or perhaps it was, now he belongs to the angels. The accounts differ. The distinction matters less than the sentiment, that Lincoln was no longer a man but something else entirely. A myth, a symbol, a national possession. The body that had wrestled Jack Armstrong, that had split rails and walked the circuit courts and stood on platforms across Illinois, that body was now cargo. It would be embalmed, displayed, transported, buried, exhumed, reburied, and finally secured in a tomb designed to prevent future grave robberies. It would become a relic. The physical Lincoln, the wrestler, the walker, the man of inexhaustible physical energy, would be replaced by the monumental Lincoln, seated in marble, frozen in perpetuity. But the body had done its work. The body had carried the mind that wrote the speeches, the hands that signed the documents, the voice that told the jokes and delivered the arguments, and somehow held together a political coalition long enough to win a war that could easily have been lost. Without the body, there is no Lincoln. Without the long arms and the frontier strength and the willingness to step into the ring, without all of that, there is only abstraction. The body matters. The physical Lincoln, the one who existed in space and time, who ate and slept and wrestled and laughed, is the foundation on which the monument rests. And the monument, for all its grandeur, is only an attempt to capture something that was once alive and is now gone. In the end, what are we left with? A man who rose from nothing. This is the part of the story that Americans love to tell themselves, and it is true enough that it bears repeating. Abraham Lincoln was born into poverty on the frontier. He had less than a year of formal schooling. He lost his mother at 9. He failed at business, suffered from depression, lost multiple elections before winning one. He was self-taught in law, self-taught in politics, self-taught in almost everything. He became President of the United States. This narrative is not false, but it is incomplete. It makes Lincoln's rise seem inevitable, even destined, the natural unfolding of American meritocracy, proof that anyone can make it if they work hard enough. What it obscures is the contingency, the luck, the narrow margins that separated success from failure at every turn. If Lincoln had lost that first wrestling match to Jack Armstrong, if the New Salem villagers had seen him humiliated instead of triumphant, would he have gained the respect that allowed him to build a career in that community? Perhaps, perhaps not. If the Clary's Grove boys had decided to beat him up instead of welcoming him into their circle, would he have stayed in New Salem at all? If Denton Offutt's store had not failed, would Lincoln have turned to law and politics, or would he have remained a shopkeeper? If his business partnership with William Barry had not collapsed, leaving him with years of debt he called the national debt of his life, would he have developed the discipline and determination that carried him forward? History is contingent. The man who became Lincoln was shaped by circumstances he did not choose, by accidents of timing and geography and personality, by the specific people he happened to meet and the specific challenges he happened to face. There is no inevitability in his story. There is only one thing after another, choices made and consequences unfolding, a life assembled piece by piece from available materials. This is what the wrestling teaches us, finally. Not that Lincoln was strong, though he was. Not that he was competitive, though he was that too. But that he was willing to engage with the world as he found it, to step into the ring, to grapple with circumstances rather than complain about them, to accept the rules of the game and then try to win anyway. The rules were often unfair. The game was often rigged. Lincoln knew this better than most. He had felt the weight of poverty, the sting of social condescension, the frustration of watching wealthier men glide through openings that remained closed to him. But he played the game. He adapted. He found the holds that worked and abandoned the ones that didn't. He learned from his losses. The single defeat to Lorenzo Dow Thompson, the multiple election losses, the personal tragedies that never stopped coming. And he kept going. This is not the same as saying that hard work always pays off, or that America is a land of equal opportunity, or that anyone can become president if they just believe in themselves. These are fairy tales. The truth is harder and less comforting. Most people who start where Lincoln started end up nowhere. Most people who wrestle Jack Armstrong lose. Most people who run for office are defeated and forgotten. But Lincoln won. Not because he was destined to, not because the universe bent toward his success, but because he was good enough and lucky enough and stubborn enough to keep going when almost anyone else would have quit. This is not destiny. This is something more interesting. This is what happens when a particular person with particular gifts and particular flaws encounters a particular moment in history and does not flinch. The tomb in Springfield is granite and bronze. It sits on a hillside in Oak Ridge Cemetery, surrounded by trees that Lincoln never saw. The original oaks were cut down long ago. Inside, in a chamber 10 feet below ground level, encased in tons of concrete designed to prevent theft, lies what remains of the body. The skull, the bones, the long arms that once gripped and twisted and threw. The wrestler is still in there, somewhere. The rail splitter. The flatboat man. The store clerk who arrived in New Salem with nothing but his height and his willingness to work. All of that is buried under the monument, under the legend, under 160 years of myth and memory and misremembering. But sometimes, if you stand in the right place at the right moment, in the ruins of New Salem maybe, on a quiet morning when the tourists have not yet arrived, when the grass is still wet with dew, and the prairie stretches out to the horizon as it did in 1831, sometimes you can almost see him. The young man, the tall one, standing in a clearing, sleeves rolled, shoulders squared, waiting for the next opponent, not knowing what comes next, not knowing that he will win 300 matches and lose only one, that he will practice law and enter politics and fail and fail and fail again before finally succeeding, that he will preside over the bloodiest war in American history and sign the document that frees 4 million enslaved human beings and take a bullet to the head before he can see what his work has wrought. He does not know any of that yet. He only knows that there is a man across from him, and the villagers are watching, and bets have been placed, and the moment has arrived when he must step forward or step back. He steps forward. He always steps forward. And somewhere in that choice, repeated 1,000 times across a lifetime, in wrestling rings and courtrooms and legislative chambers and the great crucible of the war, somewhere in that repeated willingness to engage, we find the Lincoln who matters. Not the marble statue, not the face on the currency, not the mythology. The man in the tall grass, waiting.